The Catholic intellectual tradition is one that celebrates both faith and reason as valid forms of knowledge, which means that when those things are working together, the human person is optimized to be what they are as a rational soul. So the last thing that a Catholic should ever be willing to do is to abandon either their faith or their reason, one for the other, or just altogether. And forgive me for saying this, but there does seem to be a lot about the environmentalist and the climate activist movements that do require us to embrace a lot of suspiciously, seemingly incoherent ideas, or at least solutions that you couldn't say that they benefit from the full spectrum of what human thought can offer, both scientific as well as metaphysical and ethical. One example that always hits me sideways is this idea that we have to save the planet. This is the kind of language that is inherent within a lot of environmentalist campaigns, as well as green legislative policies and agendas. They say, we got to save the planet. Now, the problem with this line of thinking is that the planet doesn't need to be saved. A slightly warmer global temperature is hardly the destruction of the planet or of the world. Apart from us, it really doesn't mean anything to save the planet for its own sake. The planet has existed in all manner of conditions that we would consider far worse than what might happen due to climate change. Apart from us and our needs, there's really nothing you could say about the planet or certain environments that makes value judgments about them. For example, the Arctic tundra, which isn't too far from where I live, features temperatures below minus 60 degrees and hardly any signs of life. And that is a perfectly valid environment. There's nothing intrinsically good or bad about it. The slope of an active volcano with magma and lava and pyroclastic flows, if that's even the right language, I don't know what you call it, that is a perfectly valid environment. The surface of the moon or another planet like Mars or Jupiter, those again are perfectly valid environments. The only way that we can say that one environment is preferable or better than the other is if you are judging it based on how hospitable it is to life and especially human life. So any attempt to say that a certain vision or constitution of the planet is better than any other is to say that it is more conducive to providing for human life than another. So any attempt to discuss saving the planet without accounting for human need as like the primary consideration, the center of gravity to this discussion, is completely nonsensical. It's smuggling in all kinds of variables and desires without admitting that they are intrinsic to that conversation. In other words, it takes too much for granted. Therefore, any attempt at preserving or protecting the environment must be informed by the fundamental question of what will best promote human flourishing. And sometimes that might mean cutting down a forest. Sometimes that might mean mining coal. It might even mean a warmer climate, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. So when anyone starts to talk about saving the planet or protecting the environment for its own sake, especially at the expense of human well-being, I'd say it's safe to say that they've taken a seriously wrong turn in their thinking. Another serious logical problem that I see unaddressed in the conversations in environmentalist movements is the fact that they are promoting a vision of the Earth that doesn't currently exist. Maybe it could someday, but for now it is only a potential outcome and not an actually existing scenario. And for some people, based on their current systems of belief and the necessity for coherence within those belief systems, that's a valid thing to do. But for certain people, specifically and especially naturalist, materialist, atheists, that is something that you cannot promote without betraying your naturalism and your atheism in the process. And that's curious because a lot of naturalist atheists do seem to be doing just that thing. On August 3rd, 2019, for example, Richard Dawkins posted to his Facebook page that climate change is the biggest crisis we have ever faced together. And in 2019, the American Humanist Association launched the Humanist Environmental Response Effort for Climate initiative, in which they said climate change is the greatest threat facing our world and humanists are compelled to act. So what's wrong with that, right? Well, let me explain. A naturalist atheist is someone who doesn't believe that there's anything more than the natural physical facts that are accessible to our senses. There is nothing that transcends the natural world like a supernature, let alone a god. Only what can be observed with our physical senses and then interpreted with our intellect is admitted to our understanding of reality. Okay, so if I were to sit down with somebody with those basic assumptions about what is real and what informs their sense of reality, I would ask them, if you could make the world a better place, what would it be like? Like, tell me a few of the attributes of a truly good world. What would that look like? And they might say something like, well, there would be no more war, no hunger, everyone would share their resources, and there'd be no more pollution or the burning of fossil fuels. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying that this is what every atheist wants or what they would say in reply. I'm just saying that those might be some of the things that a person would identify as an ideal world scenario. The only point I'm making here is that I bet most naturalist atheists can and would be willing to describe a better world that they would want to live in and that we should work towards realizing. Okay, so my follow-up question to that vision is, it's kind of a stupid question, but it's unfortunately necessary. I would ask them, does that world exist? To which the reply would be, of course, no, it doesn't. Which is to say that the world they envision, which is good and right, is not a world that exists. Our senses have never observed it, and science has never observed a world like that. Therefore, knowledge of such a world does not come through science, and it does not come through what we observe as natural physical facts which currently exist. Therefore, my last inquiry in that line of questioning would be, how do you have knowledge of this potential world and how do you know that it's good? Where does the vision and the inspiration for this good world that ought to be come from if it's not observed in material physical facts? It must by logical necessity come from someone or something that transcends the facts that we observe in the natural world. It must come from outside the natural world, since it doesn't come from inside, which makes it a question of metaphysics, the supernatural, and the transcendent. And that makes it a question for the philosopher or the theologian, but it is not something that the atheist can speculate about unless he or she abandons their atheism in the process. So really, if atheists want to contribute to a conversation about climate change, all they can really say is things like, climate change is happening and look, here's some data about it. What they can't say is this is bad and we have to do something about it. We have to prevent this tragedy from unfolding, because any attempt to do that is to try to introduce knowledge of something that transcends the mere natural observed facts. They're smuggling in a vision of what ought to become that isn't observed through the natural facts and isn't observed through science, which by their own insistence is all that there is. But you know who can talk about what ought to be done is theists, metaphysicians, and true philosophers, because by our own creeds, we admit that there is something more that transcends the physical facts. So we can talk about potential worlds and which ones are preferable. So if I can talk about Catholic theists for a second, which is my own tribe, what is it that we can offer and contribute to that conversation? Well, again, any solution that we offer must place human need and human life at the center of all other considerations. There can't be any discussion about protecting the planet or protecting the environment apart from human need, because that's just nonsense, as we observed earlier. And that's a problem for us, because a lot of the proposals we get from environmentalists and green policymakers don't seem to respect or appreciate what is best for the largest number of people, especially the poor. So why do I say that? Because the first immediate solution we keep hearing from policymakers and environmentalists is that we have to stop using fossil fuels and we have to go carbon neutral. We have to turn off the taps on affordable energy in favor of renewable energy. Well, here's the problem with that. Renewable energy isn't nearly as affordable or reliable as fossil fuels are. Maybe it will be someday, and maybe when that day comes, that would be great, and we could make a transition over to renewable energy as long as it doesn't hurt or disrupt vulnerable economic systems and the vulnerable people who rely upon them. But until then, turning off the taps to affordable energy means forcing untold millions, maybe even billions of people into desperate poverty because they can't afford the necessities of life like food, shelter, and warmth, or perhaps air conditioning for their homes. We heat and we cool our homes, we farm our food, we transport that food, and we make use of necessary travel for things like work because of the availability of affordable energy. But going carbon neutral means ending affordable energy. Here's what Nobel Prize winning Yale economist William Norhaus said. He said, "For any policy to be effective in solving global warming, it must raise the market price of carbon, which will raise the market prices of fossil fuels and the products of fossil fuels." Obviously, things like gas and natural gas and oil and all of these kinds of things will go up in price, but the things that we don't appreciate will go up in price are almost all of the products that get manufactured in warehouses that consume a lot, and factories that consume a lot of energy. A lot of the plastics and a lot of the products that we rely upon are made from fossil fuels. And what Nordhaus says will happen is exactly what we have seen in countries that have aggressively pursued this kind of agenda. Germany, for example, has been trying to subsidize renewable energy by taxing affordable energy, which has led to utility cost increases of up to 50% for the working class just over the past decade. And the worst part of that is that none of these subsidies have reduced the emissions in that time either. So the working class gets constricted by an extremely less affordable cost of living, and nothing improves as far as emissions go. And it seems to me that most green policy solutions are a lot like that. Super high cost to everyone who isn't already filthy rich with no environmental benefit. The other thing that affordable fossil fuels have enabled, and this is arguably the most important consideration, so don't skip past this in your mind, is that we can use heavy equipment to perform the necessary labor to produce and then to distribute our food. Because the last time we were carbon neutral as a species was prior to the Industrial Revolution. And this was a time when the vast, overwhelming majority of people lived and worked on farms, because that's how much manpower it took to ensure that we could all feed ourselves. And those farming communities had to be localized because we couldn't transport huge amounts of grain and produce to remote areas like we can now, because of fossil fuels. So just imagine for a second what would happen to our farming and agricultural sector if we made affordable fossil fuels a thing of the past. All of that heavy equipment, which has replaced the necessary human power that we need to produce our food, would be decommissioned. Not to mention all the trucks and the trains that we transport our food and distribute to all the populace. But they could just replace their equipment with something that runs on electricity, right? Well, without getting into the conversation about where electricity comes from, we'll just say, yeah, okay, so farmers, you need to all buy Tesla harvesters and combines and tractors and things like that. Well, the problem with this is that, as any farmer will tell you, they will have spent a long period of time, sometimes generations, building up their fleet of equipment. We're talking about millions of dollars of equipment here. To expect a farmer to either replace his or her fleet because they aren't allowed to burn fossil fuels anymore is basically to tell them to stop farming. And the first to suffer in a scenario like that, again, is the poor. When resources become scarce, the vulnerable are the first to go without, and that is an intolerable proposition from a Catholic perspective. But what good is affordable energy if we're all going to die from a collapsing climate, many will argue? Well, the first thing I would say to this is that there really isn't strong evidence that that is happening or that that's going to happen. Yes, climate change is real and anthropogenic, but it isn't nearly as bad as politicians and mainstream media who rely on alarming headlines to sell advertising would lead us to believe. All we know is that the climate is getting slightly warmer, but we can't say with any measure of certainty what the cost of that will be, especially as compared to the potential benefits, which don't really seem to get much airtime in these conversations. Like, what about the agricultural benefits of something like a longer growing season to help feed a growing population? What about plant life, which tends to thrive on an abundance of CO2, which may flourish in areas where it hasn't previously? And it's a common misunderstanding that the UN has given us just a matter of years to solve this problem before we all die. The truth is that they haven't really said anything like that. And while I'd like to spend more time on explaining what they have said, I would rather direct you to Dr. Bjorn Lomborg, who has gone through all of that data, and he summarizes it and assesses the costs and the benefits of pursuing green agendas. And that's an important consideration, and one that we should be attentive to, because you may have noticed that the people who are always pushing these green policies and agendas, they never do give us cost-benefit analysis. They just say crazy things like, we're all going to die if we don't do this, which is the kind of hysteria that is absolutely not conducive to sober and thoughtful discourse and action. Lastly, if I can introduce the faith dimension into this conversation for a second, for those of us that come from a Judeo-Christian tradition, if we're attentive to it, we will notice that in the story of the fall of humanity in the book of Genesis, when our ancestors sinned against God for the first time, prior to that, they were living in a condition that was in a complete and natural harmony between the human creature and creation. In the garden, there was no disharmony. The ground and the plant life provided everything that they needed. But when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ruptured their relationship and their harmony with God and therefore creation and everything that he created, there's an interesting sequence in the consequences that Scripture records. The first thing that God does is he curses the serpent who tricked them because, yeah, what a jerk, right? But he doesn't curse Adam and Eve. Instead, he curses the ground beneath them so that it will no longer provide for them as it once did, forcing Adam, and specifically Adam, to toil painfully to acquire the food that they need. Which means that because of the rupture with the Creator, creation would no longer persist in a state of harmony with itself and with us. Now, whether you consider that to be a matter of history or a myth, the essential takeaway that Scripture records and recognizes is that there was a harmony between us and the environment, and that harmony should exist. And it traces the effect of what we now find in our tension with the environment that we live in to our disharmony with God through sin. A massive takeaway from this that we should be attentive to is that for people of faith, that harmony that existed in the garden, that will never be recovered until God restores all creation to himself, including us. We will always be forced to labor against systems of the world to survive because the world is cursed to persist in a fashion that treats us as somehow incompatible with it. So if environmental care and being a good steward of creation is an important thing to you, it would follow that the very first step is to seek first the kingdom, seek harmony with God. In other words, become holy, be sanctified, be transformed by God's grace. And as you do so, you may find yourself operating in ways by virtue in uniformity with the natural world. That is the condition and the state that will naturally produce solutions to our problems. And those are the kinds of people that we should be listening to. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.
Pray, brethren, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty Father.